Welcome to CivilNet. The Asian Development Bank just marked its 10th anniversary of service and operations in Armenia. Joining me here to talk about it is the country director of ADB, David Dole. David, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. As I said, ADB, 10 years in Armenia. And you have invested over $1 billion in the country. Maybe a very general question, but what have been the successes and the failures in that sort of 10-year journey?
Well, let's start with the successes.
Okay.
I first have to give credit to all of the partners that we work with. We work directly with the government on financing and implementing the government's projects, with the private sector, with civil society, and with other international organizations. So anything ADB has accomplished in Armenia, the credit has to be shared with all of our partners. Now, with that acknowledgement, I think I would highlight a few successes of ADB in Armenia. I think probably the biggest one is getting started with the North-South Road. The idea for the North-South Road came before ADB was here. I think even, even before Armenia joined ADB, the idea had been there. But the government came to ADB with the idea. ADB helped the government develop the concept. We developed the first projects and financed those and got the whole project started. Now we have other organizations working on the North-South Road. We have the European Investment Bank, which will be financing the northern parts of the road, and we have the Eurasian Development Bank financing the southern parts of the road, and we're working on finishing the whole thing. So, of course, it's not finished yet, but I think getting started on that big, important project was a major accomplishment for the government and ADB together. I think another accomplishment recently would be our new seismic safety improvement program. It hasn't actually started officially yet. ADB approved the financing in September, and now the government's going through its processes to formally approve the financing. We think that'll be finished soon, and we'll start with the rehabilitation of about 50 schools in Armenia. Now there are more than 1,000 schools in Armenia. Eventually we'll get through all of those that need to be rehabilitated. Of course, it's going to take a while, but it's been a really, I think, important accomplishment to get to this point where we are now, because looking back, say, 4 or 5 years ago, when I first started in Armenia, this was something that was always an important issue, but wasn't yet on the agenda high enough to actually start financing. And then I think another accomplishment would be, well, still yet to be achieved, is on solid waste. We have been working with the government for the past 3 or 4 years on developing environmentally sound solid waste management in Armenia. There's still no environment.
Sure, something that's a very important issue.
Yes, yeah. We're still not there yet. We're developing new projects, and I hope those will be ready to be financed and implemented next year.
Okay. And the challenges, let's not call them failures, let's call them challenges.
Well, the challenges, of course, were getting started. Armenia joined ADB in 2005, and then it was 2007 when we started our first project here. So we, come into the country, we don't know anybody, we don't really know anything about the country, so we started slow, we built our relationships, we found good projects to start with that were relatively easy. We started with rehabilitation projects, particularly rehabilitation of water supply systems and roads, just to get off on a good start. And those projects have indeed been very successful. So that challenge of getting started was the first one we faced. And recently, of course, we faced challenges in getting started with the North-South Road project.
Sure, excuse me for interrupting, but because it's still riddled with problems. I mean, just as people who use the road, we've seen that there seems that there hasn't been much work being done on the road itself, and I think there's been constant delays with the road, and wasn't the Armenian government responsible for implementing the actual project? So when they're late, do they pay fines or dues, and how does that relate? How does that translate? Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say it's riddled with problems.
Okay.
There's been many issues, technical issues to overcome. Almost all of those issues have been overcome now.
Are they overcome now? Because
Almost
there were
all of them,
problems with
yeah.
some foreign contractors, right? With the service delivery and quality.
Yes.
So those have been resolved?
Almost all of them. We're still working with the government on those. We have some technical assistance with the government, providing them some experts on construction practices and testing the pavements.
Was it perhaps too ambitious for Armenia's government to implement? Perhaps were we ready to implement that huge project of connecting the north with the south?
It was definitely ambitious. I wouldn't say too ambitious, because look, now we're making good progress. One of the big challenges has been in land acquisition and resettlement, because the way the road is being constructed, at least now, the section to Gyumri, is there will be a new second carriageway where there was never any road before, and so you have to acquire. So
it's a question of eminent domain now for this.
Yes. Now, in ADB we call that involuntary resettlement, because it's
sure.
The government acquiring the land. But in the end, we ideally hope it will all be voluntary acquisition.
Right.
That is, that the landowners are given a fair price and they agree to sell their property. Right. But to go through that process at the highest international standards, which has definitely happened, is a lot of work. Yeah. There's a lot of analysis that goes into that to estimate fair economic values for everyone. There's a lot of consultation that's involved in just seeing what the landowners' concerns are, how are they using their property, and so on, so that they can be made a fair.
Yeah, because if they make a living off the property, it's valued at a different rate, or if they're just living on the property, it's valued differently, I'm assuming, right?
Well, everything is valued at the market rate. We
right.
try to make sure that they get the fair market value for their property. When markets are a little bit thin, it's harder to get information like that, so we have to estimate the economic values sometimes, like for example, what would be the profits coming from an orchard or something.
Yeah. That would be a huge challenge in any country, never mind.
Oh yes, it's always a challenge in every country, but this was, I think, the first large-scale land acquisition in Armenia, so there were lots of technical challenges to overcome. There was challenges in titles and things like this, just the records, everything had to be learned, and had to be learned from start to go through this whole process. But now the process is going very well, the land acquisition process, and we think that it can continue to progress very smoothly, but of course with still the same hard work and challenges still to come in the future.
Well, any kind of large infrastructure project has a lot of challenges. How do you monitor how the government is implementing them, or do you have a system in place to monitor and evaluate it? And then is there ongoing consultation with them, with ADB and the government, how to improve the implementation process, or you don't get involved in that?
Yes, we do get involved in that. First, for example, one kind of contract that we use, that we encourage and even require the government to use, involves the government hiring an independent supervisor to check the works and approve those works technically before the contractor can be paid. So that's one part of the oversight, the supervision of the implementation of the project. That's really from a technical perspective, an engineering perspective. We also work with the government, with our specialists coming from ADB headquarters 2 or 3 times a year or more as needed, to check on the progress, to report to ADB headquarters, flag any issues, and as needed, mobilize more resources, like we have done this year with more technical assistance for the government to handle these kind of technical problems.
And the response by the government has been positive? They willing to listen and sit down?
Of course, yes. Well,
and have you seen
actually,
improvement?
I would say it's more that the government's asking us for help rather than...
So they're realizing where the shortcomings are and then asking for assistance?
They understand, the challenges that they face on a daily basis working in the project, and they often ask us for help, and we help as much as we can.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the numbers, and as I said in the opening, that you've invested over $1 billion in Armenia, 90% of which approximately has gone to the public sector, right? With these big projects, whether it's water supply, good governance, or sort of creating good business environment and the North-South corridor, and about 133 million to the private sector. Do you see this ratio changing, or is the ADB sort of mission to assist the public sector as opposed to the private sector in Armenia?
We would like that ratio to change. We would
right.
like to do more private sector financing in Armenia, as in all countries. Primarily, ADB's work in all countries has been financing public sector projects, but we do want to do more private sector financing in Armenia as everywhere. The challenge is always to find those good projects, and also to have the capacity, from ADB's side also to finance that, whether it's our own, just having enough people available to come from ADB headquarters to do the work, to put together the deals.
Yeah, and you also work with civil society as well? So you would be providing loans or financing grants for civil society organizations, or is it a little bit different?
It's a little bit different. We do have some small grants that we have provided to civil society. For example, with the Armenia Young Women's Association, we helped them a few years ago financing some training for business women. But we more frequently work with civil society just on kind of issues and topics. For example, we are working now with the IDEA Foundation and Gyumri Project Hope to organize what we call the Gyumri Development Forum next month, to be held, of course, in Gyumri, where we hope to kind of create a new movement to spur the development and further development of Gyumri.
Sure, being Armenia's second largest city, and yet very underdeveloped in comparison to its potential, right?
Yeah, you can go there and you can see that it's still has some very beautiful architecture. Geographically, it's very strategically positioned. It has a lot of potential, but you can also see that it's suffered over the past, say, 25 or more years.
So especially because of the earthquake.
Starting with the earthquake, and then with the the reforms and the end of the Soviet Union, and just the difficulties that it's faced with building a new industry there.
I'm curious, when large corporations, organizations like the ADB come to Armenia, or to countries similar to Armenia, whether that's in the post-Soviet space or developing democracies, and you invest a lot of time, money, and effort, do you expect, or do you place obligations, again, I'm not only speaking about Armenia, before the governments you are working with, that they have to comply with these standards or regulations or types of governance and accountability and transparency, or is that not part of the mandate of ADB?
Well, yes, it is. For example, on the, let's say, take the North-South Road again, when the government takes a loan from ADB, it agrees to follow ADB's guidelines for public procurement, for environmental protection, and for land acquisition and resettlement. Those are all standard conditions in our loan agreements, and we work very closely with the government and very hard on our side to make sure that all of those requirements are met. In other programs, we can have more kind of program-specific conditions. For example, we have recently completed a program which we call the Infrastructure Sustainability Support Program, which was a 2-year program of reforms in the government to improve the sustainability and the maintenance of roads and water supply systems. And we worked with the government to develop those reforms and then to implement them over the past 2 years.
Okay, so after 10 years of operation and service in Armenia, the ADB still sees its cooperation with the country as a viable thing, and we will be moving forward for the next foreseeable future?
Oh yes, we have, after 10 years, a very strong relationship with the government, and we're building our relationships with the private sector and civil society. We see a lot more important things to do here in Armenia, and we're glad to be working here for the next 10 years and beyond.
Well, we'd be glad to have you continue doing that kind of work. David Dole, thank you so much. Thank you for all the work that the ADB is doing, and hopefully we will see real fundamental change in projects and the way government operates and the way they implement programs in the country.
Oh, I agree, and thank you again for the invitation. It's my pleasure.
I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest was David Dole, the Country Director for the Asian Development Bank. Keep following CivilNet.